Sure. And please stop me if you need me to keep on a certain time frame. I've worked on EMV for 20 years, so I have a lot to share. I've been at Visa 22 years, and 20 of those on EMV or smart card technology all around the world. So I'd like to just kind of clarify a few possible misperceptions about chip and chip and PIN. There are some countries that went to chip and PIN in the early days of EMV because those countries, the UK and France primarily, didn't have the access to cheap online reliable telecom that we have here in the US. So what we're seeing is really a convergence of two different approaches to addressing fraud. One was when EMV was first implemented, there was a lot of controls in the chip on the card to actually act on the card issuer's behalf and approve transactions offline between the card and the terminal. And then maybe later that day or the next day, the transaction would actually get submitted into the system for clearing and settlement. So there was a lot of risk control between the chip and the terminal to be able to manage those transactions. That's also why an offline PIN number was introduced, because not only authenticating that card was capable with that chip in the card, but the PIN number gave the merchant and the issuer some more assurance that it was truly the cardholder who was conducting that transaction. So in that offline nature of the card authenticating the transaction and validating it on the issuer's behalf, a PIN provided an additional layer of security. In the U.S., we have invested in online real-time fraud scoring because every transaction for many years has been coming into our network real-time and gets an instantaneous authorization. We actually score 500 different data elements for every transaction, up to 9,000 times a second, in how we validate transactions, and we still have very low fraud. But what we're seeing now is in the rest of the world that previously had offline environments, with the onset of internet connectivity and IP protocols for terminals, they now have online access and they can do all of that back-end scoring as well. They're actually moving away from using a PIN at the point of sale as they move to mobile and contactless payments. So in Australia, for example, which is frequently cited as being chip and PIN, 70% of their debit volume is conducted via contactless, either on a contactless card or a mobile phone, up to $100, no pen. And they've seen no negative impact in terms of fraud. What we really get for EMV is the ability for that chip to create this one-time code, dynamic data, the chip cryptogram, which gives us the ability to have extra data in the transaction that changes with each transaction, and that's what we use to address counterfeit. For lost and stolen, we actually address that much more effectively using the predictive analytics in the system to detect whether or not this is typical spending behavior in the cardholder's pattern, because we see transactions, again, real time every time. And so we're seeing a convergence of the other countries moving to online networks, mobile technologies, scoring transactions using biometrics. In the US, we're moving to adding the unique one-time code we get for chip to give us the ability to know that this transaction is being authenticated by this unique cryptogram, this unique one-time code coming from this card that changes each time. That also takes the merchant out of fraud's way or out of harm's way, because if that data is stolen out of a merchant system in a data breach, that data cannot be used to create a counterfeit card. So in the countries that we've seen that have moved to EMV, typically the liability shift date, like we have here in October 2015, is the milestone to get the market to start to move. And that's when the market starts to move to liability or to chip. But it typically takes about 4 or 5 years after the liability shift date for us to get to about 90% of the market moving to EMV. So if we look at Australia, Canada, and Brazil, for example, as recent countries that have moved to EMV, at the time of their liability shift date, they had around 45% of their transaction volume being conducted as a chip card at a chip terminal. And then it took them another 3 to 4 years afterwards to get closer to 90% of the transaction volume being connected as EMV. However, about a year or two after the liability shift date, when they got to closer to 60% of their volume being conducted as chip, they saw dramatic decreases in counterfeit fraud, between 60 and 80% of a decrease in counterfeit fraud, which is 2/3 of the fraud that we see at the point of sale environment today in a face-to-face world. So we really are, as the other folks have commented, Rachel and Alex have commented, we really are focusing on EMV and counterfeit fraud and how EMV addresses counterfeit fraud. Investing in doing PIN at the point of sale in the U.S. on the credit infrastructure, the debit infrastructure has PIN, but on the credit processing processing infrastructure would be an incremental investment in moving to another technology where we're really trying to move towards EMV to get that dynamic data in the system. We do see merchant terminals today in many merchant environments. About 30% of them have the chip reading hardware, but they still need to update their software in the back end to be able to process EMV. By Visa's estimates, what we've seen so far in the system, there are about 100,000 merchants as of the end of December that have enabled their terminals to be able to actually process an EMV chip transaction. But the estimates that we have for the industry is by the end of this calendar year, roughly half of all of the cards in the U.S., 575 million cards, and roughly half of all of the merchant locations will be upgraded to support EMV chip transactions, which is very much on pace with what we've seen in other parts of the world that have migrated to EMV by the time of their liability shift dates. Some other things I'd like to add in terms of the cost of upgrading. Even though many merchants today have terminals in place, there are several low-cost terminals available for particularly the small businesses to take advantage. Square has a device that's $39 that is chip reading for those merchants that take Square. There's also a device that we've seen advertised at Costco. It's a $99 chip reading terminal for merchants that are small businesses that want to upgrade to EMV. So it's rather affordable and cost-effective, particularly for the small businesses. On the card issuing side, the big issuers pay about $1 to $2 per card to issue an EMV chip card because there is an incremental investment in putting the chip on the card, whereas the community banks and the credit unions, because they're typically buying much smaller quantities, they can pay upwards of $8 per card. So there's a bigger investment if you're making a smaller issuance number of cards, which is why we have the liability shift date as a way to move the market so that both parties, the merchants and the issuers, can make the investment decisions that make the most sense to them. The way that the liability shift works is it's important to know that today issuers hold all of the liability for any fraud on the card. So if it's a lost and stolen transaction, the consumer is not liable. We have zero liability in this country for the consumers. If there's any lost and stolen fraud or counterfeit fraud on the card, the issuer holds the liability for that transaction. The way the liability shift works is going forward from October of 2015, if the issuer has issued a chip card, and that chip card, which will still have a mag stripe on the back for global acceptance capabilities, if that card is swiped at a terminal that does not yet have the capability of reading the chip, if that turns out to be a fraudulent mag stripe swipe, for example, it could have been a counterfeited card, then the issuer has the ability to charge back that fraud to the merchant. So the merchant, there's no mandate for them to invest in chip, but if they invest in chip, they protect themselves from potentially becoming liable for counterfeit fraud. There is not a lost and stolen liability shift from a Visa point of view, so the merchant's not liable for lost and stolen for Visa. And then I'll address your online question if you like.
If you would, and then we'll open it for questions from my colleagues.
So from an online perspective, we really see security and payment system security as a layered approach. We recognize that there's no silver bullet. There's no one solution that's going to address all environments. So when you look at EMV, it really addresses counterfeit in the card-present environment. For the online space and the e-com space, we're investing in tokenization, which I know we have another discussion about later, which is the ability to change the account number so that the account number that's being stored in a merchant system or in a mobile wallet, for example, it's a representation of your account number, but it's not the actual number. So if that number is ever stolen, it can't be used to create a counterfeit card, or it can't be typed in on somebody's laptop to do a fraudulent transaction on an e-commerce site, for example. So it's basically giving a ghost PAN or a different number for your account that can only be used in that channel, be it a mobile wallet, or at that specific retailer's site like Amazon.com, for example. And so it makes it much more difficult for a fraudster to get access to data in the e-commerce space that they can then use to create fraudulent transactions elsewhere. So tokenization is more of our solution for mobile and e-com and online, whereas for the physical world, it's EMV chip and that technology and getting the one-time code. And then we continue to invest in all of the predictive analytics on the back end to score the transactions. Each time issuer gets an authorization, they get a fraud score that tells them what the likelihood is of that transaction being fraudulent, that they can then incorporate into their authorization decision.
Thank you. At this time, I would like to open up to questions.
Mr. Chair?
Oh, yeah, I would like to have you wrap up after them, but if you'd like to respond to any of that.
I had a comment I'd like to make to
Please.
some extent. I'm sitting here listening to PIN technology being bashed, and I don't understand. In 2013, a joint submission to the Australian Competition Consumer Commission, Visa and MasterCard said, quote, requiring the use of a personal identification number rather than permitting signature as a means of customer authentication for all or almost all transactions at point of sale is a proven method of reducing card fraud. They also said it is much more difficult for a fraud perpetrator to ascertain a PIN than to forge a signature. Accordingly, one of the most effective ways of combating fraud, particularly lost, stolen, and NRI fraud, is to make the use of PIN for customer verification compulsory. Further, Visa and MasterCard also proposed a communication strategy in Australia to educate cardholders about the importance of PIN. And it's not only the card networks. The Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City stated as long as a card issuer maintains the magnetic strip, either alone or on payment cards or along with a computer chip, there will continue to be a significant and possibly increasing source of counterfeit card fraud. Further, the Reserve Bank stated if weaker authorization protocols continue, such as signature for card payments rather than PINs, the degree of fraud reduction that can be achieved will be limited.
Mr. Chair, I would just like to clarify from a MasterCard perspective, we are not disputing the security of PIN. That is an authenticator. EMV is the technology. It creates that dynamic code. As the payment network, Visa and MasterCard similarly situated, we can support whatever the merchant would like to do for their particular business. So if a merchant wants to authenticate using a signature, our technology can support that. If a merchant wants to use a PIN, and to all of Mr. Dombrowski's points, fair enough, they should, and we can support that. It's just about what makes sense in terms of from your standpoint as public policy makers, how do we get the most security? And the most secure is by allowing technology innovations into the future. So PIN is a great solution to layer onto that EMV technology, which on its own creates counterfeiting cards almost impossible. But we need to allow those layers, the biometrics, the tokenization, all of that layers on top. And so we're not disputing PIN. We agree that it is a great component, and depending on the merchant and their acquiring bank, whatever technology that they would like to use based on their business, they should.
So if it came to a point in the future where we felt like we needed further security, PINs could be added on top of the EMV layer, which is the structure for going forward.
Yes, it's just it's the card reader, and it would allow that PIN authenticator at the point of sale. And it's something that can be done with the current technology. It doesn't, I mean, everybody supports it as a choice. We like to say chip, pin, and choice at MasterCard. So, you know, it's whatever you decide.
Yeah, I'd like to clarify.
And before you do that, and I do want to open up to my colleagues, I want to thank my colleague and chairman of the Arts, Entertainment, and Digital Media Committee, Ian Calderon, for stopping by too. And I do want to open up to my colleagues for questions. But, I mean, when you say the PIN, so this is very similar, and then you added choice to a debit card. A debit card, most of them have now a Visa or MasterCard or other logo on it that you can either use as a credit card or choose to use as a debit card with a PIN. Would this be a similar transition in the future? Could you forestall seeing that?
Yes, it is. The PIN is an authenticator. It is a way to authenticate the card holder. An authenticator is something you have, something you know, or something you are. Something you have is a PIN that allows that card holder to be authenticated that way. Signature is something you have, or a biometric is something you are. It depends on your business model as a merchant, and whether, you know, fuel merchants that take card not present transactions, they tend to be you know, a transaction that has a higher degree of fraud, so they need to be protected in a different way. That's why you use your PIN at the pump. That's completely, you know, that is a good fit for that type of transaction. Not every transaction is going to warrant that type of authenticator, and we believe it should be up to the merchant to decide, and that they should definitely use PIN if that's how they deem appropriate for their business.
And then we'll go to Stephanie just to clarify. But before I do that, I mean, so this would be very similar to when you're at the gas station now and you're putting in your debit card, you need to use your PIN number, but when you put in your credit card, you need to use your zip code for most areas.
Right.
Would that be correct?
It would be correct. I think unfortunately, it's a little bit more complex.
Yeah.
So the debit processing infrastructure in the United States has historically been plumbed, if you will, to support PIN, because there's a lot of networks in the U.S. that use PIN authentication, because it came out of your ATM card being extended to being used at the point of sale. So people know their PIN on their ATM card that they use to get cash out of the ATM. When those debit networks expanded from being just ATM networks to then being able to use them for purchases at the point of sale and accessing your debit account, PIN was used because that infrastructure was already there. In comparison, on the credit side, that infrastructure to authenticate a PIN and carry a PIN and validate a PIN was not part of the original system. So investing in PIN in the U.S., it could be something that could be done, but we're very agnostic. We support PIN and we support signature. We also support what's called no CVM, or no cardholder verification method. You're probably familiar with when you swipe your card today for a purchase at a grocery store up to $50, you don't have to sign. And so that's called no CVM, and that's part of our rules. A transaction under $50 at a grocery store, $25 most other places. They're low risk, so you don't have to enter a PIN or even sign for those transactions. So to invest in PIN for the U.S., we're really focusing on moving to EMV and also the railroad that we need for mobile. And the great thing about investing in EMV is that added security that we're bringing to the point of sale to carry that dynamic one-time code. That same field message format also supports mobile technology. So we're using that same railroad. That's a significant enough investment in itself to also plumb the whole credit infrastructure for PIN, knowing that we're moving to other sophisticated technologies such as biometric and mobile and other ways of authenticating things. It may have a shorter shelf life in the United States than PIN has had elsewhere. And there are many countries around the world that have gone to chip and signature. Some countries that went to chip and PIN, they did PIN on chip because they were already doing PIN on magstripe, which is similar to what was going on in Australia. So if you look at every country, you really have to look at it as a country-by-country basis based on what infrastructure and technology they already had in place and where did it make sense. So many of the countries that are chip and PIN, they were already using PIN very prevalently on magstripe. We do still see, as we move to chip in the U.S., that you'd continue to use your PIN on your debit card because that infrastructure is there, and oftentimes people get cash back at the point of sale, or even from the ATM, you're still going to always use your PIN. What we're talking about is not necessarily laying over an incremental investment on the credit side to mandate moving to PIN and doing a technology-specific mandate versus really focusing on incentivizing the market to move to dynamic data and EMV and that cryptogram that secures the cards as well as lays the infrastructure for mobile, and not being specific on a mandate as it regards to PIN. 75% of the merchants today in the U.S. don't have a PIN pad reader, and they don't have the capability to support PIN. And it's also a static value that if somebody intercepts, they can actually then use your PIN and a counterfeit magstripe and go take cash out of the ATM. So sometimes it moves fraud, maybe not from the retail environment, but to the ATMs. So that's one other thing to consider is PIN is a static value. It's an incremental piece of data that needs to be encrypted or managed in the system that might have a short shelf life in terms of where we're going with mobile and other technologies and could introduce other fraud. So we're supportive of PIN, but there are bigger implications.
Thank you for the clarification. I'd like to open up to my colleagues. Anyone have any questions for the panel?
Alex, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I heard you use the analogy about a helmet in a vehicle and the association with EMV plus the PIN. But I just also heard conflicting data testimony about perhaps that might not be the best usage. Could you sort of expand upon that, the situation in which you had indicated as it relates to PIN and also the EMV?
Yeah, I mean, the point I was trying to make was that EMV, really, the chip itself is the dynamic technology that's necessary. And it's, it's kind of joking around, but it's like you're wearing suspenders when you already have a belt on. I mean, you already have that protection with the chip, which only has a one-time verification code. So when Rachel said earlier, they're practically impossible to replicate. So if you have a large data security breach or any kind of data security breach at the retail level in which credit card information is acquired, you wouldn't be able to take that information and then create counterfeit cards and then use those cards to commit fraudulent activity, because by the time you use your card again, you will have changed the verification code on that. And so where we see is the biggest area of fraudulent activity is in the counterfeit fraud area and online fraud, and they're through data security breaches, that if we just attack the one part of it, which is the main part, which is the putting the chip in there, that the PIN is not really necessary, because you've already stopped the bleeding at the point in which the cut occurred, and you've dealt with the problem. So it's going to be very difficult to deal with lost or stolen cards. That's the instances in which someone takes your card from the mail, or someone rips off your wallet or purse, and so they use that card. So, as was mentioned earlier by Visa too, we're just adding another layer of security on top of the ecosystem we have now, which is chip and signature, or which is mag stripe and signature. So you just do the chip, you've dealt with that issue. The PIN, one, it's not necessary, and two, it doesn't provide for a very good customer experience. If you talk to a lot of retailers too, it is to get that customer out of that line as soon as possible and have that thing flow. What happens if you forget your PIN? You change your PIN. I don't know how many passwords I have for whether it's my securities account, and whether it's my ATM, and it's to get on Amazon, and all those things. You're not, because you all have the same thing, right? And then you try to change it. One requires a numeric code and something else, and then you're like, oh, geez, which one is it? And then I always have to send me a new password. Right? So what happens if you forget your PIN, and then it's like, well, now I got to swipe my card. And so it creates a whole new problem for the customer who just wants to buy their stuff and get out of the store. And it's something that is not necessary, and all you're doing is creating, I think, a worse customer experience. At the end of the day, though, the customer has zero liability.
Mr. Calderon, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. I don't really have a question as much as I just have a comment. I first wanted to thank the chairman for allowing me to participate today. I do not sit on this committee, but the chairman has recognized my interest in the area of tech and allowed me to sit on here. So I want to thank you for leading this discussion, while at the same time inviting me to participate in it. And when it comes to this topic, I mean, yeah, we're talking about finances and money, but we really are talking about a lot of other things. I mean, arguably, with what you deal with, you are dealing with some of the most sensitive and private information that an individual has. And there's a dynamic between that kind of userability, or the ability for us to kind of have these products that make things easier for us to purchase things or to pay our bills. I mean, I use this to pay every single one of my bills online, while at the same time, shop whenever I do shop. And we want to make sure that we provide the best user experience, while at the same time having a certain amount of privacy or security that allows us to freely navigate online without feeling like our information is going to be compromised and used in a way that we didn't approve. And but when it comes to also this technology, given the information that you're dealing with and the sensitivity of it, it kind of sets up hallmarks in terms of what can your technology and what you're doing also be applied to? If I can pay using that sensitive information on my phone, can I use the same technology that you're using to vote on my phone and to secure it, put it in a position where it is secure enough for me to cast my vote that is going to be my vote, using whatever it is that you're using to secure our financial information? So I really have a lot of interest in what it is that you're all doing and this topic of discussion. And I want to again thank the chairman for allowing me, in my capacity as chairman of the Arts, Entertainment, Sports, Tourism, and Internet Media Committee, to sit on this panel today. And thank you for your hard work.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
The implementation of EMV is already in place, is it not?
Mm-hmm.
So, yes. Could you speak to that, the success of it, and as you are doing the implementation process, is there any hindrance, and where is it coming from?
Yes. Mr. Chair, the EMV roadmap was something that I had originally intended to speak to, so maybe I'll just back up and talk about how we got where we are today with 575 million chip cards estimated by the end of 2015. So back in 2011, the card networks realized, that there was a need to do this. In order for it to be successful, implementation had to be done on a broad scale, because you can imagine if there was just one issuer or several issuers doing the EMV chip cards, fraud would just move around and it wouldn't be eradicated, which, probably never eradicate it totally, but we can try. And so the point was to do it in a very organized and methodical fashion so that all participants in the payment system could plan and migrate in an effective and organized way. And that includes everything from the acquirer to the merchant to the network to the issuer and the consumer with their card. So in 2012, EMV roadmaps were first introduced by MasterCard and I believe Visa as well in 2012. And what that said was it was a roadmap to the implementation. And Stephanie mentioned the liability shift, and that's the key component of the roadmap. So what we said was that was when we introduced the October 2015 deadline, and the reason why that deadline is working is because of the liability shift. So traditionally, issuers take the liability. That's the risk inherent to issuing credit or maintaining a checking account in an institution. And so that risk, which traditionally lies on the issuer, is now going to move to the party with the least secure technology. So that way, a merchant is motivated to upgrade their technology. Likewise, an issuer is motivated to issue chip cards to their banking customers. So the liability shift is working, and everyone in the payment system has known about it since 2012, so it's been plenty of time to, in an organized fashion, build it into business plans, and we believe that that's why it's really working, and that we'll have 50% of cards by the end of 2015, and then from there, even, the adoption will be, even more. That's sort of the historical piece of it. Thank you.
Any further questions? I would just like to wrap up the question segment here with a few technical questions. If either of the three of you on this side could touch just quickly again on the online component and how EMV will change not only the experience but also increase security for online. Also, I know, Alex, you touched on biometrics being incorporated into the EMV. If you could just further expand just briefly on that. And my final question, and maybe Mr. Dombrowski, you could touch on this, will merchants still be encouraged and retailers still be encouraged to ask to check physical driver's license, IDs, at the point of sale? Will that be still something that will be encouraged when you're at the local grocery store, at the local department store, purchasing goods? Will they still be encouraged to check or even required to check IDs?
That's an interesting question. The privacy laws in California have caused a few class action lawsuits on that issue of checking driver's license, so we're a little sensitive, but I think you can safely say that when best practice for a retailer would be to check ID whenever they think appropriate, but you have to walk the line with the legal statutes of California.
Possibly a digital ID in the future.
Yes, we don't have a requirement to check the ID because, again, the liability for the transaction falls on the issuer, and we are authenticating the transaction each time. So there are certain times of the transaction where a signature is required as another form of authentication for the consumer. But really the merchant's not on the hook, if you will, to make sure that it's truly a signature match of that person versus a signature, or even the ID, because that's not the way in which the liability for the transactions is managed in the system. It's the issuer approves that transaction based on what they know about the cardholder, and the cardholder being in good standing with their system, and the transaction details that they're seeing, and they're taking the risk for that fraud. When it comes to the online piece, I just want to make sure that we're clear that EMV itself doesn't do anything to address online fraud. Mm-hmm. So that's why we're looking at other types of technology such as 3D Secure and tokenization and risk-based authentication and sending one-time passwords to your phone, other methods that we can do a step-up authentication. We either tokenize the account number so that it's not something that can be intercepted and stolen and used elsewhere. And then we also do step-up authentication or risk-based authentication if the transaction characteristics seem outside outside the person's normal shopping behavior, where they might get prompted to have a one-time code text to their phone or email to them that they would enter in at the time of transactions. So those methods are being more widely invested in going forward. They're not necessarily pervasive yet, but those are the ways in which we're addressing online fraud, whereas EMV is very, very specific to the physical world card present space because it needs to be a chip on your card interacting with the terminal.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, and what I meant by EMV, easing the way for additional biometrics, what I meant by that was once you have the peace of mind, the security that those cards have not been counterfeited, then you can go ahead and use those cards in other forms which require additional forms of authentication. For example, you'll be loading your credit cards onto your phone for a mobile wallet, but you want to make sure no one else is doing that on their phone and then using that information. So what it does, it provides the added security knowing that you are who you are and those cards are not counterfeit cards. And then you can use other forms of payment, being your phone, which then would have a biometric in order to actually open the phone itself. And so not necessarily that it runs the entire program, but it makes it easier and works in partnership with those other forms of authentication.
Very good. Thank you so much. I really do appreciate everyone on the panel today. I hope that you will work together as your industries obviously are all centrally kind of located within the same realm on this possible hopefully consumer breakthrough in terms of protection, security, privacy, and fundamentally in terms of ease of access to usage. So I hope you all work together to find common ground on some of these issues. I really do appreciate the information today and look forward to working with everyone in the committee goes forward.
Thank you.